diminish this president's authority to deal with a default on our national debt. This authority, so-called extraordinary measures or emergency measures, gives to presidents, going back to President Kennedy, the wherewithal through the Treasury Department to try to avoid an economic disaster which could impact families, businesses, jobs, and the reputation of the United States in the world.
Mr. President, a couple of hours ago I was here on the Senate floor urging and encouraging the House to act on a compromise proposal to deal with the current fiscal issues before us that included the no Washington exemption from Obamacare language. As I said, I think that's very, very important for two reasons. One, the principle. I think the first rule of American democracy should be that Washington lives by the same rules as it imposes on America under Obamacare, under everything. And secondly, a very practical consideration. I think the quicker we do that, the quicker we start getting things right, the quicker we start understanding in a gut personal way the real challenges and burdens of Obamacare, and the quicker we start changing that. I return just a couple hours later to congratulate the House because apparently they're moving in exactly that direction. And all indications are that they'll be going to the Rules Committee very, very soon with a package that features, that really has as its centerpiece, that no Washington exemptions from Obamacare language. Again, I think it's important for all the reasons I said. I also want to point out that assuming the House passes that, I think they're going to tonight, that no Washington exemptions language will be the only thing, the only substantial thing in that proposal that hasn't been essentially agreed to by Senate Democrats. Everything else are details, a date here, minor provisions. The only major difference between what the House is hopefully passing tonight and what's been agreed to in discussions by Senate Democrats is that no Washington exemption language. So the question will be, is this perceived crisis, is this standoff really going to continue over that, over members protecting their wallets, their special elite status, demanding that they're treated differently than other Americans under Obamacare? Is it really going to continue and not be resolved over that? I think that's what it will all be about, again, assuming, as I hope it does, the House passes this proposal tonight. Again, Mr. President, the Obamacare language, the statute itself does not allow for this special exemption or special subsidy. That is nowhere in the statute. And because of that, it was sort of an example of what Nancy Pelosi said about the Obamacare statute in general. We have to pass it to figure out what's in it. Well, it passed with language in it that said clearly members of Congress and their staff would have to go to the Obamacare exchanges for their health care, no provision for any special subsidy. And then after it passed, many folks on Capitol Hill read it to figure out what was in it. When they got to that section, they said, oh, you know what, we can't live under this. We can't stand for this. So then a fierce lobbying campaign started to get the administration to fix Obamacare, but not to fix it for America, to fix it for Congress. And that resulted in a special Obama administration rule that was conveniently issued right as Congress was leaving Washington for the August recess, right as Congress was fleeing the scene of the crime. That rule really did two things, neither of which is in the statute. And that's why it's a completely illegal rule contrary to the statute, in my opinion. First of all, the rule said when the statute says that members of Congress and their staff have to go to the exchanges for their health care, well, we don't know who official staff is. We can't figure that out, the administrative agency said. So we're going to leave that up to each individual member of Congress. Now, that's absurd. The language is clear. All official staff are covered. The administration should have demanded on the rule that all official staff are covered and not leave it up to individual members. But under this cozy relationship, an individual member can exempt any staffer that he or she likes. In fact, in theory, that member can exempt all of his staff and say, it's up to me, they are not official staff for purposes of this provision of Obamacare. That's absurd on its face. And then the second thing this special rule for Congress only did is say, well, for those who go to the exchanges, including members, they get to take a huge taxpayer-funded subsidy with them, a subsidy available to no other American at that income level, no other American. That's not in the Obamacare statute, and that is made up out of thin air in terms of this rule. So we need to correct that situation, and we need to make sure that Washington is treated like America. First, because it's the right thing to do. It should be the first guiding principle of American democracy. Second, for the practical reason I stated. The quicker we do that on Obamacare and across the board, the quicker Washington, Congress, the President will start getting important matters, including impact of Obamacare, right.
Will the senator yield for a question?
I will in just a moment. Again, I congratulate the House for doing exactly that, And again, I would point out, assuming the House does that and passes that tonight, the only significant difference between their package and what Senate Democrats have agreed to in discussions here will be this no Washington exemption language from Obamacare. There'll be other very minor differences, a date here, language regarding how income verification is handled, very, very minor compared to this central issue. So that's what it's coming down to, and that will be what Senate action on that House proposal is about. I'll be happy to yield to my distinguished colleague from Illinois.
Since the senator from Louisiana, I'd say through the chair, has raised on the floor many times the issue of the health insurance of members of Congress, I will volunteer that I'm under the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program. Some 8 million federal employees, including members of Congress and their staff, are currently under the same health insurance program across the nation. I have the same health insurance policy as the park ranger at the Lincoln home in Springfield, Illinois. I would ask the senator from Louisiana, what is your health insurance policy?
I'm under exactly the same program, and what I'm suggesting is merely that we follow the law. The distinguished senator and many of his Democratic colleagues constantly make the point that Obamacare is the law of the land. He's right. I want to change that largely. You don't. It is the law of the land as we speak.
Senator, will you yield?
And that, let me finish, and that law of the land is crystal clear. It has a specific provision about this, and it says every member of Congress and all of their official staff can no longer stay in that plan, have to go to the Obamacare exchanges, the so-called fallback provision for the American people. And I think there was a reason for that. I think there was thinking behind that, and it's simple, that we should live under that same scenario that millions of Americans have to live under, 8 million plus, who don't want to have to go to the exchanges, who like the insurance plan they have now, who heard the President say, if you like the plan you have now, you can keep it, and who found out after the fact that that just wasn't true for them. 8 million plus who are being forced off coverage they like to go to the Obamacare exchanges.
Senator,
they don't get
further question.
They don't get any subsidy.
They
don't get this special treatment, and I'm suggesting we should not as well.
The senator will yield for further question through the chair.
Yes.
The senator, I hope, will concede that members of Congress and their staff are going into the insurance exchanges because of an express provision requiring that to happen in the law offered by Republican Senators Coburn and Grassley. Secondly, what we're dealing with here is a strange situation. Obamacare doesn't force anybody into the insurance exchange. It is available for those who have no health insurance or those who are on individual health insurance plans and want to buy something different. So
if
let
I
me ask
can
this-
respond and reclaim my time, I don't think that's true at all. I think Obamacare absolutely forces millions of other Americans into the exchange.
If I could...
Now, I've reclaimed my time. Now, it's not the same mechanism that it is for members of Congress. It's not an express provision, but it's forcing 8 million plus Americans into the exchanges against their will nonetheless. Because there are many, many Americans who want to keep the coverage they have. They heard over and over from President Obama, if you like the coverage you have, you can keep it. And then they found out that for them, that was a lie. They did like the coverage they have. They are losing it against their will. And I don't think that's by accident. I think that's by design, because the Obamacare statute creates clear incentives for many, many employers to get out of the health insurance provision business and to just let their workers go to the exchanges. And so I completely disagree with the statement from the senator from Illinois when he said no other American was forced on to the exchanges. Millions of other Americans were forced on to the exchanges in a different way, but absolutely millions of Americans were forced onto the exchanges against their will.
If Senator yield further for a question through the chair, since the senator is under the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program, his monthly premiums for his health insurance and my health insurance receive an employer contribution. That's how most Americans who work get their health insurance. The employer contribution he receives and I receive about 72% of the premium. The senator from Louisiana has characterized an employer contribution as a government subsidy. I would like to ask the senator from Louisiana, is he prepared to disclose the government subsidy, as he calls it, that he has personally received for his health insurance as a member of the United States Senate?
Absolutely. That's all reclaiming my time and reclaiming the floor. That is absolutely public information. That is true. What I'm merely suggesting is that Obamacare mandates a change, and that is the law of the land, as you and your Democratic colleagues make the point many, many times, and we should live by the law of the land. And as the distinguished senator from Illinois absolutely knows, there is no provision in the Obamacare statute for that subsidy to transfer to the exchanges for members or congressional staff. No provision whatsoever. And in fact, having that happen is inconsistent with the law, because the requirements of exchange policies are different than the requirements for FEHBP policies, so it is completely inconsistent with the law for that subsidy to follow members of Congress to the exchanges. It's nowhere mentioned in the statute.
Would the senator
it's made up out of thin air under this illegal Obama administration rule with no sufficient statutory basis in the law.
Senator yield for a question?
Yes.
If the senator is stating that no one under an insurance exchange, no one can receive an employer contribution for their health insurance, he is wrong.
Reclaiming my time and reclaiming the floor, I did not state that, and I will not state that. What I did state is that there is no subsidy available to members of Congress and congressional staff under the Obamacare statute. There is no provision in the statute for that old FEHBP subsidy to magically redo itself as an exchange subsidy. There is absolutely no provision of that whatsoever. And folks, these 8 million Americans who were forced out of the plans they liked, they're not getting a subsidy. They're going to the individual exchange, and they're getting no comparable subsidy. Now, if they're low enough income, they get a subsidy for being at a certain income level.
Senator from Louisiana's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
And I would urge again that the Senate stand tall, stand with the American people, not stand for Washington elites. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The Assistant Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I'm glad to have that exchange with my colleague, because you see, he comes to the floor repeatedly and says things which aren't altogether accurate. That's why I wanted to speak to him today, and he yielded for a question, and I thank him. I'm sorry he's left, because I'd like to further engage him in dialogue. There's a reason why he left. there are questions he can't answer. And if he tries to answer them, his whole case explodes in front of him. We created these insurance exchange for 40 or 50 million Americans who have no health insurance or had rotten health insurance. They were paying a fortune for bad health insurance policies. When he says 8 million people were forced in the exchanges, here's what he's really saying. 8 million people had health insurance policies that were so bad that those policies, frankly, had to be rewritten. Here's what we said is the law now under the Obamacare. You offer a health insurance policy to my family or the senator from Connecticut's family, you cannot discriminate against a person applying for health insurance because of pre-existing conditions for anybody in your family. Anybody in their family with pre-existing conditions? We all do. And we decided that was fundamentally unfair. If you have a child with asthma, a wife with diabetes, mental illness in your family, for goodness sakes, you shouldn't be discriminated against. That's one of the provisions of Obamacare, which many on the other side of the aisle want to repeal. Secondly, we said, we can have no lifetime limits on your health insurance policy. What does that mean? In the old days, you'd buy a policy that says, we'll give you great coverage up to $100,000, then you're on your own. $100,000, that ought to be just great. Until you end up in the doctor's office the next day, or someone in your family, with a serious cancer diagnosis, with surgery, chemo, radiation, going on for a long period of time that goes way over $100,000, and it can happen. I had a routine surgery 3 years ago, routine, and it turned out just fine. It cost over $100,000. If I had one of those limited policies, I would have had to start paying out of my pocket. So we eliminated that and said you can't have a cap on insurance policies. They want to repeal that. They want caps on insurance policies. Turned out that 60% of the family insurance policies in America did not cover maternity benefits. How about that? How about that? Love families and love children? Well, how about making sure health insurance covers them? That's in Obamacare, and they want to repeal it. The list goes on. Here's the point I want to get to. Members of Congress are now going to be covered by the same insurance policies offered by Obamacare, and our staff will too. That's acceptable to me. I've taken a look at what's available. It's as good as anything members of Congress receive today. I'm not worried about the quality of coverage for myself and my wife. It'll be just fine. I can live with that. But currently, the senator from Louisiana, this senator, and every other senator, when it comes to health insurance, has the same health insurance as federal employees. 8 million federal employees and their families. Same basic coverage. I think it's pretty darn good. I've said that on the floor. People have corrected me saying, Senator, you may have a policy worth, I don't know, $15,000 a year. There are people who have policies worth $40,000 a year. So I'll just leave it at this. I think I have good coverage for myself and my wife. I can match that coverage in terms of the quality of coverage on the insurance exchanges without fear of interruption in service and protection for me and my wife. So I feel good about that. Here's what the senator from Louisiana is upset about. When I go on the insurance exchange, which is required by law, not voluntary, required by law, he doesn't want the employer to make any contributions for my health insurance for my family. And he says our staff should be under the same restriction. Well, people who get their health insurance through their employer across America, virtually all of them have employer contributions. This is common. There's nothing sinister or sneaky about it. And so now he calls it a government subsidy, the employer contribution. All I ask is this. I'll go on the insurance exchange, happily do so. Treat me the same way when it comes to employer contribution for my health insurance and my staff health insurance as every other federal employee. Just that simple. He says no. That's special treatment for members of Congress. Well, the senator from Louisiana is just plain wrong. And he stands here on the floor and talks about special privileges for members of Congress. Let me tell you what I'm prepared to do. I'm prepared to put a specific provision in the law which says no member of Congress or member of any congressional staff shall receive any special privileges or additional rights not available to every other person under the SHOP or insurance exchange program. How's that? I could live with that because, as he almost acknowledged, currently employer contributions can be made for those who are on the insurance exchanges. It's there. We're not getting anything too unusual. It's already there. And so this argument about some special treatment for members of Congress, no way. And I'll tell you what bothers me the most about this, Senator, Mr. President, Senator from Connecticut. What bothers me the most about this, it doesn't take an act of political courage to take money away from somebody else. In this case, away from our staff people. You know, I started out here as an intern a long, long time ago when I was in college, and I worked around the Hill all my life. There are some extraordinary people here. People go to work every darn day to make me look good, to answer the phone, try to satisfy the needs of the people of Illinois, to deal with some pretty serious cases that involve life and death sometimes, or federal benefits. They work long hours, they do great work, and because of their great work, they cover me in glory with regularity. I can't thank them enough. What a thanks this is, to say to them, we're going to eliminate your employer's contribution for your health insurance. You're on your own. That's what the senator from Louisiana wants to do. If he thinks employer's contribution for health insurance is something that is sinister, shouldn't be allowed for members of Congress and their staff, hang on tight, because we have 150 million people in America who have health insurance through their work with an employer contribution. Is that his next target? Is he going after them? Well, he's in for a fight, because people can't afford health insurance without employers helping to pay. We put it in the tax code. We've got to protect it in the tax code. We've got to beat the Vitter Amendment. Think about this for a second. We started this debate 2 weeks ago. A senator from Texas took the floor for 21 hours, stayed up all night. His goal, let's defund Obamacare. What happened? His side ended up shutting down the government and putting us now within 36 hours of defaulting on our national debt for the first time in history over the issue of defunding Obamacare. Haven't heard that recently, have you? They stopped talking about it because something's happened. Over 12 million people are now going on the internet trying to find whether they can get eligible for an insurance policy, health insurance policy. The popularity of Obamacare has gone up as the Republicans have criticized it, because there are an awful lot of people out there who don't have health insurance, or they have health insurance they can't afford. I'm not going to make excuses for the problems with the computers and the internet as the program kicks off. It better improve, and it will. But it shows you when you're overwhelmed with people who want health insurance, what happens? The system broke down. Well, we've got to get better. But during this period of time when the other side was railing against Obamacare, the numbers of approval for Obamacare were going up across America. It didn't work. They gave up on defunding Obamacare. I haven't heard that phrase in a long time. 2 weeks ago, the senator from Texas, but not since. And so now they've decided that instead of defunding Obamacare, they're going to follow the senator from Louisiana who wants to take the health insurance away or make it prohibitively expensive for members of Congress and their staff. That's it. That's what this has been all about. We have shut down the government, and we have run the risk of defaulting on our debts for the first time in history over whether or not our employees, the people on our staff, are going to get a federal government contribution for paying their health insurance. That's pathetic. That is pathetic that we've reached that point. I believe health insurance is a right. It isn't a privilege. And I believe employer-sponsored health insurance is a good thing that we ought to protect. And I believe members of Congress ought to play by the same rules as everybody else in the insurance exchanges, and our staff should as well. And if he accepts those as premises, his amendment goes away, disappears. But if he's out to get the employer contribution on health insurance, maybe that's his goal, have at it. I think he's going to find it's a very lonely battle. Most Americans, Democrats and Republicans, value health insurance, need to have it at times in their lives to give them peace of mind they're getting the best care. And this war on health insurance for individuals, the uninsured, even members of Congress and their employees is mindless. It is mindless and petty. We've got to do better. We need to expand the reach of health insurance across America. We're going to. In this effort to defund Obamacare and now this Vitter Amendment, we have to defeat both of those efforts. Once this program is in place and Americans have this protection, you're never going to take it away. Once you have that peace of mind with affordable health insurance, and 6 out of 10 of the people who go into the insurance exchanges will pay less than $100 a month for health insurance, less than a cable bill. Finally, they get health insurance. That's what it's all about. Once it happens, once it moves forward, it'll become one of the basic things in America that we count on to protect ourselves and our families. We've got to defeat this Vitter amendment. It is just pathetic that we've reached this point with the shutdown of the government and the idea of defaulting on the debt that it's come down to this amendment. It really is sad. It doesn't speak well for those on the other side who started off with this lofty goal to defund Obamacare. And in the end, all they want to do is to raise the cost of health insurance for the people who are working night and day for them in their offices across America. I hope the people of this country understand what this debate has finally descended to and will join us in defeating this Vitter amendment. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. The House Rules Committee is meeting in about 40 minutes from now at 5:40 Eastern about the latest House GOP proposal to end the government shutdown and raise the nation's borrowing limit. We saw Senator Vitter on the floor about a half hour ago. A measure he's offered dealing with Capitol Hill staff and their health care is expected to be included in the proposal. The Hill has a bit more about that. By this afternoon, Republican leaders had dropped a proposal to delay a medical device tax, making a provision to strip employer contributions that lawmakers and congressional staff get for health insurance as the only Obamacare-related measure. That in the Hill. House Democrats had a meeting with the president at the White House, and the Democratic leaders spoke on the White House driveway after the meeting. Mike O'Brien with NBC News tweets, post-White House meeting, Pelosi says GOP will have to pass its debt CR bill with 100% Republican votes. Getting back to the Senate, Arizona Republican John McCain responded to what Senator Reid said earlier today about the House GOP debt proposals.
Last 24 hours, a lot has been taking place. A tentative agreement has been reached between both Republican and Democrat leader. The Speaker of the House has come forward with what we believe is a plan which would reopen the government, would extend the debt limit, and has several other provisions in it. And the reaction to that has been condemnation, immediate, automatic condemnation by the majority leader, by the White House, by the Democrats in the House, absolutely rejecting this proposal. I don't understand that. I don't understand that visceral reaction in a most negative fashion. Why don't we try something like we used to do around this place? Why don't we say, look, you've got a proposal to open the government, we've got a proposal to open the government, let's both pass, let's go to conference, which we could do in 24 hours and resolve our differences. I understand what the polling data says, that 74% of the American people disapprove of the Republican handling of this issue, and I agree with that. Was some of us at the beginning that said we're going on a fool's errand to believe that we will be able to defund Obamacare. And we got ourselves in a ditch. And we got to stop digging. That is well understood here by certainly the overwhelming majority of my Republican colleagues. But for the majority leader and the Democrats in the House and the White House to say absolutely categorically not, we will not consider what the Republicans in the House of Representatives are doing, in my view, is piling on. It's piling on, and it's not right. So I urge my Democrat colleagues, let's sit down and work this out. You've got a proposal from the House. We have a proposal between the two leaders, and let's get this resolved. to categorically reject what the House of Representatives and the Speaker is doing, and I think he's pretty courageous in what he's doing, in my view, is not serving the American people. So let's stop this. Let's stop it, sit down, consider the Speaker's proposal, get our proposal done, and then get this resolved, which we could do in the next 24 hours. I came to the floor to express my disappointment in the categorical rejection of a good faith effort by the Speaker of the House, which doesn't contain provisions all that I want. I'm sure that the agreement that's made by both the Senate majority and Republican leaders will not be everything that I want. So let's stop the condemnation. Let's consider the Republican House proposal as a serious proposal, as a way to end this gridlock, and then let's sit down together and get this thing done. I again urge my Democratic colleagues, we know you have the upper hand. Isn't it time that we help to find a way out of this, which is what the American people want, rather than who won and who lost? The only people that are losing right now are the people of this country. As I've mentioned a couple of times before, al-Qaeda is not in shutdown. I urge my colleagues to reconsider, on the Democrat side in the White House, to reconsider their categorical rejection of any proposal from the House of Representatives. I yield the floor.
Again, the House Rules Committee is expected to announce a new GOP debt proposal shortly. That's expected to come up for a vote in the House tonight. That Rules Committee meeting is at 5:40 Eastern with live coverage on C-SPAN. Today is the 15th day of the government shutdown, and the nation's borrowing limit will be reached on Thursday. Former Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty heads a trade association that represents financial services companies. He was on Washington Journal this morning giving Wall Street's view of a possible default on our debt.
With Tim Pawlenty, who is the president and CEO of the Financial Services Roundtable, and of course, as our viewers know, the former governor from Minnesota and presidential candidate back in 2012. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Greta.
Let me show the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Senate nears deal on debt and showdown. Reid McConnell pushed temporary plan to allow talks. The prospects are murky in the House, though. What do you make of this emerging deal and the details that we've heard so far?
Well, it appears to be an agreement just to delay ultimate decision-making. So the good news is it appears if it goes through, both the Senate and the House, and that's a remaining question, but if it does go through, it delays the decision-making. That's the bad part. The good news is there won't be a default, at least not right now, and nobody wants a default. That would be a terrible outcome for the country.
There have, of course, been some Republicans in the House and in the Senate who have said we can prioritize our debt. If we default on October 17th, if we can't come to a deal, we can prioritize our debt.
Well, of course, the federal government takes in about $2.5 trillion a year in revenue and spends over $3.5 trillion. So you can do that for a while, Greta, but the money eventually runs out. So you can prioritize and try to do that. But one thing the Treasury has said, we don't even have the ability from a system standpoint to program the computers that way. But even if they could, clearly they spend more than they take in. And so that trick doesn't work for very long. And
then there's the concern that people stop buying Treasury bonds. This is a story from the front page of the Wall Street Journal this morning. Uneasy investors sell billions in treasuries. Min Zhang reporting, while leaders in Washington have been chasing a deal to avert a default, investors and banks have dumped billions of dollars in government debt. In the past 2 weeks, investors have sold mountains of short-term debt issued by the government. Banks have also reduced their holdings, trimming such debt by more than 50% over that period.
Well, it's serious business, and the United States of America shouldn't dine and dash. We shouldn't have bills that people made spending decisions on in the past and now they won't pay. And when you have a country, sadly, that for every dollar it spends, they don't have 30 to 40 cents of it at the federal government level. In other words, they overspend what they take in. Somebody has to float that debt. Somebody has to provide that lending capability to us. And in some cases it's the Chinese, other foreign interests, other investors. And when they see at least the possibility, even if it's a small possibility of a default, guess what? They get nervous. Investors get nervous. They lack confidence. And then the economy starts to have negative consequences from that.
From that headline this morning, how do you think the markets react to that headline and the fact that this is not a done deal over on the House side?
Well, for today, anyhow, it may be a wash because on the one hand, now you have news that there's a hope of a deal, and that may give the markets some confidence. On the other hand, if the deal is shaky or later today, some key leaders say, look, this is not a deal, it's not going to go through one body or the other, then the markets will react negatively to that.
Another headline for you. We showed this to our viewers just moments ago. The Washington Times. The next move on the U.S. credit rating, D for default. Standard & Poor's quietly warning that if the nation defaults, that they will lower the country from AA to D.
Yeah, it's really, like I've said before, many people have said, anybody who has studied this, who understands what's going to happen, if the United States of America defaults on its debt, that would be a cataclysmic outcome for the economy, for the reputation of our country, for our standing in terms of not just international markets, but our international credibility. You can't go around the world and wag a finger at places like Greece and other places and say, hey, Spain, hey, Italy, get your house in order, and then they turn around and say, hey, United States, look in the mirror.
So what do you think the CEOs would, I mean, what would CEOs tell you if our rating was downgraded again?
Well, they would say whatever most people would say, which is that would be terrible. It would be terrible. So CEOs, particularly of financial institutions, are concerned about having stability. Markets don't like instability because that breeds lack of confidence. When you have lack of confidence, that destabilizes economies and, of course, all the negative things that happen from that. So, Greta, it's very clear that we need to do two things. One is we need to not default. But number two, we also need to listen to the message that we have to get our fiscal house in order. Now, this deal, if it goes through, they kick the can down the road till February, so it doesn't really solve the problem. But we have to face the reality that an 8th grader can see. It's basic math. You can't continue to spend this much more than you take in or more than you take in, and that has to be fixed.
So what would the CEOs like to see for some sort of deal? I mean, you're saying the short-term February is not good enough. How long should it be?
Well, the CEOs, of course, are not a monolith, so they have individual views. But if you took kind of a rolling average of how they feel, they would say, hey, look, let's do two things. Let's not default, but then let's also put together a compromise in a divided government that begins to address the underlying fiscal problems of the nation which caused the problem in the first place.
I want to show our viewers what you had told the New York Times back in July of 2011 when you were running for president. Here's a quote that you were in Iowa talking to Iowa voters, and you were quoted by the New York Times saying, I hope and pray and believe they should not raise the debt ceiling. These historic, dramatic moments where you can draw a line in the sand and force politicians to actually do something bold and courageous are important moments. Does that not ring true today?
Well, it does ring true in this sense. When I made that statement, of course, the so-called extraordinary measures that had not yet been exhausted, the Treasury has the ability to do certain things to delay a default, which they hadn't yet fully invoked in that moment. Now they indicate they've already exhausted all of those measures. So now this really is the drop-dead moment. And it's good to have pressure because that's what forces politicians to take action in many cases. But you don't want to so overreach that you cause or trigger a cataclysmic outcome. And that's what could happen if the United States of America defaulted, and we don't want to go there.
Part of this emerging deal would deny Treasury Secretary Jack Lew the use of special accounting measures to extend his borrowing power past February 7th. Would you, as now the head of the Financial Services Roundtable, advise the President to reject that proposal?
Well, when you have this much money going through a system that's this complicated with this many potential consequences if you misfire, I think it's good to measure twice and cut once, but also to leave yourself a little flexibility in case there's a miscalculation or a misstep. So I would not be in favor of taking away every tool that the Treasury has to manage the accounts payable for the United States. You want to leave some flexibility in that system in case you have either politicians or systems that do unpredictable things. Leave yourself a little cushion. I think that would be wise.
Let's get to viewers. Tony is up first in Virginia, Democratic caller. Hi, Tony.
Hi, ma'am. How you doing today?
Morning.
Great. Good morning. Ma'am, what this is really about is from the beginning of the time that this president has became into office, Democrats had already decided, Republicans had already decided no matter what, we're not going to work with this president. And the sad part about this whole thing is before the government shutdown, President Obama got on TV and said, look, guys, we can talk about anything, but consider who you're hurting with this government shutdown. And that's my comment.
Okay. Governor Pawlenty.
Well, I think there's, of course, all the finger pointing that goes back and forth. It's their fault. No, it's your fault. It's my fault. You know, it's somebody's fault. So this is the bickering is what the country, of course, hears and just kind of, I don't want to say tunes it out, but they expect politicians in a divided government to bicker back and forth. But they also expect something positive to happen and problems to get solved. And when they see this kind of gridlock, they get frustrated. But look, for people who might say it's all the Republicans' fault, let's remember, like I said earlier, setting aside the political spin, you could just take an 8th grader in an 8th grade math class and say, hey, 8th grader, the United States government takes in $2.5 trillion and they spend $3.7 trillion in recent year. You know, the delta in terms of overspending is, you know, over $1 trillion a year, almost $1.5 trillion a year. You know, how long do you think that can last, and do you think that's wise? An 8th grader could tell you mathematically that isn't going to work. I mean, you cannot continue to rack up year in, year out, $1 trillion deficits, which then gets rolled up and accumulated into the national debt. And eventually, the people who provide that debt are going to say, you know what, we've given the United States too much, and by the way, the system looks too shaky, and we're not going to buy it anymore. And then the price of that debt is going to go up, and then you're going to have a whole series of very negative consequences.
What are the prospects if this deal goes through that we're talking about today and they open up the government until January, raise the debt ceiling until February? What are the prospects in the meantime? They can reach some sort of grand bargain where you tackle entitlement spending, you bring spending down, and possibly a tax increase.
Well, Greta, I used to go to the horse track and bet on horses when I was younger, and one of the people who coached me in that regard said, if you want to see how horses are going to run, a good way to look at it is to look at the last 10 races that they ran and see how they performed. So if you looked at this group and these dynamics and said, what's the likelihood based on their past performance of them striking a grand bargain between now and February, since it's already mid-October, you probably wouldn't put a lot of money on that bet.
Sea of Tranquility wants to know, do you think the tax code and IRS need an overhaul? What are the obstacles? Time frame to make some headway?
Well, the Sea of Tranquility's point about, the time frame is really the hour is late. You have a $17 trillion national debt on a little over $2 trillion in revenues. But by the way, Greta, that $17 trillion doesn't even include really all of the debt or all of the outstanding obligations of the country. Many experts believe if you count all the stuff that's not on the books, it's as much as $50 trillion, some even say $70 trillion, $80 trillion on a little $2.5 trillion in revenues. I shouldn't say little, that's big. But that's a 30 to 1, 40 to 1 leverage ratio, which in most financial transactions you say that's reckless. So we have to fix that. And if you look at a pie chart of federal spending, where the money goes, just a circle pie chart, and you color this part blue, Medicaid, Medicare, interest on the national debt, you're already at the halfway point. At the rate at which that's growing, it's going to be over the three-quarter line within 15 years, and much of the rest is defense. So you have to tackle the underlying issue, which is structural spending, mostly in entitlements.
Nashville, Tennessee. Rick's next, an independent.
Good morning. Thank you for your time. My question to the former governor is this, the financial business of it all. If you were to have each state, all 50 states, stand on their own financially, abolish everything on the federal government except for one thing, and that is to protect this nation. The only tax dollars that go to Washington are from each individual state. When it comes to social issues across the nation, to domestic agendas, let each state stand on its own. My question to you, Governor, is can each state stand on its own without having assistance from the federal government? Should we go in that direction? Because we all comment we would like to see less taxation from the states to Washington. Your comment, sir. Thank you.
Well, the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution, of course, and I'm paraphrasing, expressly said those powers not expressly granted to the government are reserved to the states. And so if you look at it strictly and from a discipline standpoint about what the Constitution says, you would say the federal government probably shouldn't be doing, or many people would say you shouldn't be doing as much as they do, and that the states should take a greater role. And the Founding Fathers thought the states were the laboratories of democracy. These were the places where new things were supposed to be tried out. They could be done on a smaller scale, and if they worked and other states liked them, they could be replicated in other states. So this idea of returning to a more state-focused approach to some public policy issues, I think has a lot of appeal for those reasons. But of course, the federal government has usurped so much of that over the decades and even longer that you now have this federal behemoth that permeates American life to the chagrin of many conservatives. And people saying, look, if you look at an issue like health care, it's not a Minnesota problem, it's not a Alabama problem, it's a national problem. So you have some saying, look, jump into it nationally. But others, including me, would say, look, the federal government doesn't run many things all that well, and you should be careful about granting them big control of big chunks of the economy and big programs because they tend to not run it well. And even if they run it well, they tend to overspend. States have to balance their budgets. 49 of the 50 states have a constitutional requirement to balance their budgets every year, and guess what? It works. I wish the federal government had a requirement like that.
Jaden Miles tweets in, it's normal in bankruptcy proceedings to stop debt payments so essential services can continue. That should guide our spending.
Well, of course, bankruptcy isn't available to the federal government as a legal or technical matter, so obviously, this gets back to the issue of prioritizing spending. You could do that for a little while, I suppose, technically, assuming the computers work, but there isn't enough money to pay all the bills for very long, even if you attempted that approach.
We'll go to Jim next in Pennsylvania. Hi, Jim, Republican caller.
Hi. Hey, I just wanted to ask Mr. Pawlenty about what he thinks about the current strategy. He seems to be trying to have it both ways, saying that, well, you can't try to make a stand now. You can't obviously negotiate with these Democrats because they're never going to reach a deal to reduce spending and fix the eighth grade problem. And so his strategy seems to be do nothing and then hope for something to change in the next election.
All right, let's get a response.
Well, look, you're moving up to the immovable force is running up against the irresistible object in the sense that you can't default. That would be cataclysmic. And by the way, even a partial default, I think, would send those kind of signals to the markets and investors. And number two, you got to fix entitlements. But in order to do that, you either have to have a divided government that can agree, and in this case they can't, or somebody has to win the election contest outright to be able to prevail for the direction of the country. The country has decided, look, we're going to have a divided government. They've sent that signal nationally, and that's how Congress has split. And the White House obviously is Democrat, Senate Democrat, House Republicans. And eventually they're going to have to pick a direction as to how they want to get this resolved. And if they can't compromise in terms of the legislative process, it's going to have to get hammered out in the election.
So was it a mistake by House Republicans to tie defunding of the Affordable Care Act to the government shutdown and now the debt ceiling?
Well, if you're going to have a bluff, it's embarrassing to have your bluff called. So if you say, we're going to plant the stake and, not an inch more, you got to mean it. Otherwise, if your bluff gets called, it doesn't look so good.
And that's the position the Republicans are in right now.
Well, I think they would say, look, we want to be responsible in the end and avoid a default. And in the meantime, we did get something. They would say we only had to give a temporary extension of these issues. And it looks like if the news reports are accurate, they're at least going to get some modest adjustment in Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, relating to eligibility verification, income eligibility verification, and maybe some tax relief in that regard.
All right. We'll go to Veronica next. Boynton Beach, Florida, Democratic caller.
Hi, good morning. Former Governor Pawlenty, the only thing I don't agree with is that I believe that the head of the House, I believe that he's allowing the crazies on the Republican side to make a fool of him, and that he should stand up, put it on the floor, let them vote for it, and that's it. And I feel he would get a lot of credit instead of every day they're on TV saying, you closed up the government, the veterans can't go here. The Republicans wanted the closed. It's making them look like idiots.
Okay, referring to House Speaker John Boehner there, letting it come to the floor.
Well, there's all people who say, look, let these bills come to the floor and have a vote. But a failed vote on the House floor has consequences. You may remember in one of the early TARP votes, which of course was its own mess and disaster in many respects, the process around that. But when you brought one of the TARP bills to the House floor and it failed, the markets went down something like 600 or 700 or 800 points. So when you have a 401k or an IRA and you have a bill that triggers that kind of consequence, and you're a retiree and you're counting on that little nest egg or a significant nest egg in either case, and goes down, the market goes down 800 points, people say, well, just put it on the floor and vote. Well, that has real-world consequences if it doesn't go well. So as a leader, you got to calculate in not just the Republican versus Democrat component, but what does this do to the institution, and what message does it signal to the markets if it fails?
And on that point, we've heard Senate aides saying, we've heard House lawmakers saying that Mitch McConnell, who's negotiating with Harry Reid, will not agree to anything that cannot pass the House at this point, when you're this close to the deadline.
Well, could you imagine, Greta, if after all of this, with this close to the deadline, you put a bill on the House floor, it fails, and the stock market goes down 1,500 points?
Suspended, and I'd be able to talk for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President, we're now in the third week of a government shutdown. We're facing the imminent debt limit crisis, and it just seems like it's become the pattern around here that we live from crisis to crisis. I hope we do something about that. We obviously have to deal with the immediate issues in front of us in the next day or so, hopefully no more than that. And there have been a lot of discussions that have occurred over the course of the weekend and the last few days to try and bring to a conclusion at least this chapter of this particular crisis that we're dealing with. And, you know, I'm encouraged when I hear our colleagues on both sides of the aisle have meeting and having discussions, and we've had a number of those that have gone on. And I think so far without result. There have been meetings that have occurred between our two leaders, and they also have been working very, very hard to try and get a result, something that they could take back to the respective caucuses and present, and that hopefully could be ultimately voted on. There are also discussions that are going on in the other body, in the House of Representatives, and have been for some time, and trying to find a way, a pathway forward that could get the necessary votes to pass in the House of Representatives and then here ultimately in the United States Senate. And I heard some of my colleagues in the Democrat leadership get up on the floor this morning and denounce some of those efforts in the House of Representatives, which came as a surprise to many of us, because I don't think it should be any shock to anyone that the House of Representatives, created in Article I of the Constitution, might decide to perform some things that are consistent with its constitutional role. And so they have been working on legislation. We had the leader get up here this morning and make some comments on the floor with respect to what was happening in the House of Representatives. And he described it as a partisan attempt to appease a small group of Tea Party Republicans. He described it as an extreme piece of legislation, which, by the way, most of the elements of which have been things that had been part of a bipartisan agreement here in the United States Senate. He said it was a blatant attack on bipartisanship. He went on to say that he felt blindsided by the news from the House, and that extremist Republicans in the House of Representatives were trying to torpedo the Senate's bipartisan progress with a bill that can't pass the Senate. And went on to lament the fact that he was disappointed in the Speaker of the House. It was, I guess, again, a big surprise, Madam President, to many of us, because I don't think we should feel blindsided when the House of Representatives tries to find the necessary votes to move legislation that's so important to this country. In fact, it would appear at least that perhaps Democrats here in the Senate, the White House, which, by the way, came out and said that it was going to veto the proposal from the House of Representatives, of course, before it had ever seen it. It had never been anything in print with respect to that. So the Senate Democrats hadn't seen it, the White House hadn't seen it, but the President came out and said he's going to veto it. The Senate leader came out and said he was blindsided by this. It was extreme. It was an attempt to torpedo bipartisan discussions. It would appear, at least, that some of the Democrats around here are a lot more concerned about the political consequence and the political advantage and having the opportunity to dance on the political graves of Republicans than actually solving a problem that's important to the future of this country and to the American people. And so I think it's unfortunate that that's where we are. I hope that in the course of the next few hours, and that's about all we have left, that we'll come to some agreement. And whether that originates in the House of Representatives or originates here in the Senate, one way or the other, both are going to have to vote on it. Both are going to have to find the necessary votes to pass something that will avoid the disaster that's facing us if we don't take steps to do that. And so I guess I'm one of many who, when I heard those comments this morning, was more than just a little bit surprised to think that we here in the United States Senate would be shocked and surprised and disappointed that the House of Representatives, and blindsided, would decide to do some work and try and solve this problem as well. Ultimately, Madam President, we have to have the House and the Senate agree and concur. And I'm glad to see that the House of Representatives is proceeding in a way that will solve this problem. I hope that we will continue in the Senate to try and find a solution in the next few hours, something that we can actually pass through both houses of Congress and put on the President's desk, and something that he might be able to sign into law. But, you know, when you talk about the various elements of those proposals, most of those things that were denounced and rejected here this morning by the Democrat leaders when they came to the floor were the very things that a bipartisan group here in the Senate had been working on for several days. But I hope that when we get through this immediate crisis, Madam President, and hopefully create the process by which we might address the real problems the country faces, because this living from crisis to crisis is not a way to govern the country, and it's certainly not a way to provide certainty to our economy, and it's certainly not a way to get the economy growing and expanding again. Many of us on this side of the aisle think that we ought to have a discussion when we're raising the debt limit about how we're going to fix the debt. What are we going to do to reduce the debt? What are we going to do to ensure that we don't continue to pile trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars on the future generations of this country? And we don't seem to get serious about that. I hope that we will. And I hope that when we get past the immediate crisis, that we will take a look at the long term and say, what can we do to put this country on a more sustainable fiscal path? And I think we all know what that entails. It means we've got to get spending here in Washington, D.C. under control, and particularly in the areas of some of the mandatory spending parts of the budget. If you look at what the Congressional Budget Office says over the next 10 years, discretionary spending, which is that small part of the budget that is impacted by the sequester, is going to grow at roughly 17%. During the same period, mandatory spending is predicted to grow roughly by 79%, or $1.6 trillion over the course of the next decade. And so spending on mandatory programs continues to grow, and this CBO report underscores that reforming entitlements is absolutely necessary if we're going to get spending under control. And so we know what the issues are, Madam President. We clearly, it's not like it's a big secret. The Congressional Budget Office gives us insights into this on a regular basis. We've had lots of commissions that have studied these issues. They presented their findings. They put forward recommendations about how to address these long-term crises the country faces. And yet there seems to be the lack, I guess, if you will, of a political will here to try and actually solve the problem. Now, my own view is that if we can get through this immediate crisis, that over the course of the next couple of months, which is basically what we have to work with, that we can actually sit down, hopefully with the President, engage in this process and negotiate in a way that would allow us to fix and to put in place solutions that actually do put us on a more sustainable fiscal trajectory for this country's future. We've seen in the course of the last 4.5 years the publicly held debt of this country literally double. It took 230-some years of American history and 43 presidents to get to the first $6.3 trillion in debt. That's literally been doubled in the last 4.5 years under this administration. And so we've got a huge debt problem. Added $1 trillion a year for the first 4 years. This year, everybody is patting each other on the back and saying, gee, the debt's down or the deficit's down to $650 or $700 billion, like that's some sort of major accomplishment. That's the 5th largest deficit, literally, in history, behind the first 4 years of this administration, which were the 4 largest deficits in American history. We have an out-of-control debt. We have out-of-control deficits that are growing as a percentage of our economy and getting to the point where they're literally going to drown our economy if we don't do something about it. And so controlling the spending part of the equation, Madam President, is essential. The other thing that's essential is to get the economy growing and expanding again. When the economy is growing and expanding, it means that people are working, people are investing, people are making money, people are paying taxes, government revenues go up. and that makes a lot of these problems look much smaller by comparison, too. But you can't have an economy that's growing at 1 to 2% and an unemployment rate that is chronically at about 7.5%. And when you factor in the people who have quit looking for work or are working part-time that would rather be working full-time, that unemployment rate gets up into the double digits. So we've got chronically high unemployment, massive amounts of debt, and a sluggish economy. Those are all things that we ought to be focused on here. And in order to get the economy growing and expanding again, we've got to create the conditions, the economic conditions for small businesses to invest, to hire more people, to put their capital to work, and to try and get that economic growth rate back up to where it would allow us to deal not only with our deficits, but also to do something that would really improve the quality of life and the standard of living for people in this country. A growth rate in the 3 to 4% range is significantly different, dramatically different, than a growth rate in the 1 to 2% range. And that means a big difference in the take-home pay for middle-class Americans. If you want to see middle-class Americans do better in this economy, we have got to get the economy growing again. And that means reforming our tax code, broadening that tax base, lowering those marginal income tax rates. We have the highest business tax in the world. Makes us non-competitive in the global environment. We lose jobs every single day to other countries around the world. We need to do things that would lessen the cost of doing business in this country, make it less expensive and less difficult to create jobs, not more expensive and more difficult. And one of the things that many of us have been concerned about with respect to Obamacare is that it is making it more expensive and more difficult to create jobs. It's got higher taxes. You're seeing higher insurance premiums. Obviously, that means fewer jobs. That translates into fewer jobs. And so getting the cost of regulation to a more reasonable level, keeping the tax rates at a more reasonable level, and doing those things that are necessary to unleash this economy, Madam President, is the way that we will improve the fiscal picture in this country, coupled with good fiscal discipline and constraints on federal spending. And that means that we have to tackle the mandatory part of the budget, that part that was not affected by or at least not very much affected by the sequester. Those are the ingredients, those are the components, those are the elements, if you will, that will lead us to a situation where we're not having a crisis every few months, where we're trying to worry about debt limit increase or how we're going to fund the government. And we ought to get to a place where we are, in a more systematic way, doing the things we should be doing in the first place, passing appropriation bills. We didn't pass a single appropriation bill this year, which is why we're here at the 11th hour trying to come up with a continuing resolution to fund the government. Those are the things that we need to be doing if we're going to get this fiscal situation improved for our country and get the economy up and growing again and creating jobs and doing the things that are necessary to improve the lives of the American people. That's what I think the public wants to see. And actually, if you look at public opinion polls, and there's been a lot of discussion of that lately, by a 2-to-1 margin, people in this country believe that if you're going to raise the debt limit, you ought to do something about the debt. In fact, I saw a survey just last week by CBS News, I think it was, that said that 55% of the people in this country believed that when you're going to raise the debt limit, you ought to do something to reduce spending. And I think there were only 23% of the people surveyed who said that they supported a clean debt limit increase. The American people get it, Madam President. The people in my state of South Dakota understand that you can't spend money you don't have. You have to live within your means, and that we have to, as a federal government, do the same thing that families across this country have to do on a regular basis. So they get this. They understand what this is about, and I hope that in the next few weeks and months that we will be able, with the involvement and the engagement of the President of the United States, sit down and negotiate the sorts of resolutions, if you will, the sorts of proposals and solutions to this debt crisis, and get this country on a more sustainable fiscal path in a place where the economy is growing at a faster rate, creating the types of jobs, good-paying jobs, that will help middle-class Americans in this economy prosper. If you look at what's happened to take-home pay or to household income over the past several years, it's gone down, not up. We've seen average household income go down by $3,700 since the President took office, and it is time that we change that and got the American people back to work, incomes coming up, and jobs that will keep the young people in this country not only employed, but looking with confidence and optimism toward their future, which is something that we don't see today. So let's deal with the immediate crisis, but let's work together on that. And instead of coming over here and denouncing what's happening in the House of Representatives or using extreme language to characterize what's happening in the House of Representatives, understand that we have to function together. We are the Congress of the United States. In order for anything to get done here, we have to move legislation through both the House and the Senate. And it seems to me, at least, that there ought to be a recognition of that here in the United States Senate. And as I listened this morning to the comments of some of our leaders on the other side when they came down here and denounced what was happening in the House of Representatives, it struck me, at least, that that's not a constructive nor a productive way to get where we need to go in the next few hours. So I hope we can do that, and I'm looking forward to the kind of bipartisan cooperation that will solve this problem. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President. Senator from California.